I've said before that I think if there is a silver lining to be found at all in the China virus's arrival in the United States and the damage that it's done, both the actual damage and the damage done by government reaction or overreaction to it, one of those silver linings has been the idea that parents have been incentivized to go out and find alternative schooling for their kids. Now, in some cases, it's come at the expense of an incredible amount of effort, whether it's online schooling or a private school or some other form of education, because they've realized just how badly the conventional bricks and mortar government schools have failed kids and are especially failing them now. There are a lot of private schools out there, not expensive ones. The expensive ones are there too, but the inexpensive ones have also seemingly been able to weather this storm, while the public schools run by the governments and by the teachers' unions have not done well at all. But now that homeschooling and private schooling and online private schooling have seemed so much more attractive to parents, of course, the government bricks and mortar schools want to hang on to their market share. And so we're seeing people in academia suggest that, well, maybe we shouldn't even allow people to school their own kids. I thought we'd talk about that with Dr. Melissa Moschella, who's an assistant professor of philosophy at Catholic University of America and a visiting fellow at Heritage Foundation. Dr. Moschella, welcome to the program.
It's a pleasure to be on.
What should we make of these academics saying we shouldn't let parents school their own kids at home?
Well, the arguments are just, lazy and inaccurate. There was a Harvard Magazine article by a scholar, Elizabeth Bartlett, arguing that there should be a ban on homeschooling. And, the data that she cited was completely biased, completely not representative of the broad diversity of homeschooling parents, the vast, vast majority of whom are wonderful parents, educating their children far above the standard of even excellent private schools, let alone public schools.
Well, and in fact, one of the criticisms that I've heard for almost 30 years now, Dr. Moschella, is, and I'll be blunt this way, I've had people say, homeschool kids are weird. And I said, yeah, and that's wonderful, isn't it? And they say, what do you mean? I said, well, bricks and mortar school kids are sent to an environment where if you're in sixth grade, so you're 11 years old or 12 years old, you're with a bunch of other 11 and 12-year-olds all day long. You have almost no experience, in interacting with adults other than a teacher or perhaps a couple of teachers in a school. When you're schooled at home by mom and by dad, you may in fact be much more involved in interacting with the rest of the world, the real world, where you don't find real world situations that are all 12-year-olds in a room. You find a mix of old, young, left, right, black, white, everything else. And so sometimes I think those kids are a lot more mature because of those experiences that they're never allowed to get in a bricks and mortar school. And they say, but when I talk to them, they just seem a little different. I said, you mean because they seem a little more mature, a little more well-adjusted to talking to anybody instead of just interacting with kids their own age? That's one of the hits that I've heard over the years, that they say private school kids are weird. Well, actually, I think they're just different from government school kids who behave a certain way because of the environment you put them in, 6 or 8 hours a day for 9 months of the year with a bunch of kids their same age.
Absolutely. The homeschooled kids that I've had in my college classes are generally head and shoulders above the rest, not only in terms of academic preparation, but in terms of maturity, initiative, genuine love for learning. A lot of what happens, particularly in the public schools, is it's just so homogenized and so standardized. It often really takes away the love of learning. It prevents a kind of education that really is tailored to the unique gifts and interests of students. Prevents them from really being able to explore their interests. And, as you said, that the sort of standardization of it was actually part of the reason driving the movement for public schooling, was a desire to kind of homogenize, standardize the population, led by this kind of progressive agenda. And one of the landmark Supreme Court cases outlining parental rights as fundamental constitutional rights, Pierce versus Society of Sisters, actually picked up on this and said, they ruled that parents do have the right to send their children to private schools, and part of the reason for that, they said, was that, we do not as a government, have the role of standardizing children. In fact, we recognize, the court there recognized that there is a fundamental right of parents, that the right of parents to educate their children is prior to the educational authority of the state.
So it sounds like some of what the state wants to do is they don't like the fact that parents actually do incorporate into their lessons some lessons about values and about beliefs that may be different than the standard, woke PC point of view that is pushed at many government-run schools. And I think they're uncomfortable with that. They almost take the view that Cuba does, where it says kids don't actually belong to the parents. Parents are only allowed to care for them as long as their education of their kids does not interfere with the interests of the state. I would hate to see America go that direction, but it feels like we are.
Well, that's right. And you don't have to go to Cuba to get that kind of idea that kids belong to the state. All you have to do is go to major law review articles and look at some of the dominant scholars out there, and you'll see precisely that sentiment. There was a controversial MSNBC promo spot a few years back in which political scientist Melissa Harris Perry said, and I quote, "We have to break through our kind of private idea that kids belong to their parents or kids belong to their families and recognize that kids belong to whole communities." Right? I mean, that really does capture the dominant sentiment among very influential scholars, and they're publishing in some of the most influential journals, influencing lawyers who become judges, who rule on important cases in this regard. So even though it may seem extreme, these things do have influence. So it's important to push back against them and recognize that no, the contrary is true. Kids belong to their parents in the sense that the parents are the ones with the primary authority to decide how best to raise them, and that includes how best to educate them, particularly on the most sensitive issues about things like, for instance, gender and sexuality, which are some of the areas where, in particular, progressives want kids to be standardized by the state. I mean, what we have going on now in a number of schools is that protocols are being adopted, for instance, where children who are confused about their gender are able to kind of be treated as the gender that they identify themselves with at school, while parents are purposely being kept in the dark about it, and using basically subverting and trying to get around parents' rights to know what's going on with their children in school and avoiding any mention of this gender transition in any documents that might go home. It really is undermining even just the most basic right of parents to know what's going on about very important struggles that their children are having.
Dr. Moschella, in the last 20 seconds, and that's all I've got, do you think this movement toward homeschooling, toward private schooling, is going to survive after we're done with this pandemic and things get back to somewhat near to normal?
I hope it does, and I think there's a good chance because this has shown people really just how terribly the public schools, often really controlled by teacher union interests, are failing our children instead of actually putting the needs of children first, the way that private schools and homeschools have done.
Absolutely. Dr. Melissa Moschella, who's an assistant professor at Catholic University, visiting fellow at Heritage Foundation. Pleasure to be with you. Thank you, Dr.